have Dr. Matt Spangler to talk to us a little bit about beef indices. If you all don't know Dr. Matt Spangler, he's kind of become the connoisseur on creating and managing beef indexes. Uh, I He's a big part of BIF. He's a professor at UNL, and we're really happy to have him here this morning to kind of give you all a little bit of a rundown about how beef indexes work, how they're made, and how probably to use them. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt. We had a little problem with the slides this morning, so Gracie's going to be doing the slides, but Dr. Spangler will be going through. So whenever you guys are ready.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and certainly looking forward really to any Q&A that hopefully would exist once I'm done going through a little bit of material. So if we can advance to the first content slide, to me, the whole discussion of indexes should really start at a discussion of breeding objectives. So a breeding objective really details the direction that a breeding program should go. And it assumes, at least oftentimes, I suppose it doesn't always have to, but as I'm going to discuss it today, it assumes that profit is the desire. And so if increased profit at the commercial cattle level is the desire, then that says that the breeding objective and any corresponding selection index needs to be economically optimized. A breeding objective really quantifies the current state of production and tries to estimate future economic situations. We'll go through that in more detail, but you think of current state of production as, well, what is current hot carcass weight? What are current levels of quality grade or IMF? Future economic situations can be a challenge, and oftentimes averages of the past become a really good prediction of the future. So going through that, it should really elucidate the traits that are related to profit. So what are the things that are really profit drivers? And then lastly, accounts for the timeline that you want to consider improving profit. And this is most impactful when you consider the retention of replacement females, because the sire selection decision you make persists over time through the daughters and granddaughters if it's a self-replacing herd. So at a high level, this is what a breeding objective is. Also important to the discussion is the overall notion of an economically relevant trait. So as I'm going to define that today, and as others have defined it before me, an economically relevant trait, or an ERT, is something that is directly associated with revenue or cost. So I have some examples here. BWT is birth weight and CE is calving ease. So the question would be, which of those two things is the economically relevant trait? And I would argue that it's calving ease. Birth weight is an indicator of calving ease, but it doesn't necessarily tell us the whole calving ease story. Ribeye area versus yield grade. Now there could certainly be some debate in the beef cattle industry and the value of the yield grade equation. There's a lot of debate about that right now, but as it stands today, yield grade would actually be economically relevant. Yield grade or ribeye area is an indicator of it. I have yearling weight versus carcass weight. For some people, at least, this is one where you'd scratch your head. For people that retain ownership through the feed yard and selling the beef, as it were, it's obviously carcass weight. But there are players in our industry that would sell cattle as yearlings, in which case their primary source of revenue comes around that time and would be associated with yearling weight. So for some of these revenue-centric traits, it very much depends on the breeding objective. And then the last one I have is RFI, which is residual feed intake versus actual feed intake. I personally have fed some cattle in my life, and I've never gotten a feed bill for the residual. I always get a feed bill for how much they actually ate. And so with that very simple example in mind, feed intake is what I would define as economically relevant. Residual feed intake is actually an index, and it's a special kind of index we call restricted. It restricts gain in one trait whilst letting the other one move. So just a quick run through of what an economically relevant trait is and is not. Next slide. So since we've talked about economically relevant traits, we should talk about indicator traits as well. I kind of mentioned that on the last slide in my birth weight calving ease example. The question would be, why would you ever use an indicator trait? So why might you have EPDs for things that are not by themselves economically relevant? Well, in a lot of cases, indicator traits can be measured earlier in life. So that's beneficial to get data earlier. They may be cheaper or easier to measure, um, and things that can be measured on both sexes. So those are kind of traditional buckets that an indicator trait would fall into, and they can be very useful when the thing we're really wishing to change might be expensive or doesn't manifest until much later in the animal's life. Next slide. All right, with that just a little bit of brief background behind us, I wanted to talk about selecting for multiple traits simultaneously. So that's really the heart of using an index, because there's more than one trait that impacts profitability, right? Regardless of what your breeding objective is, there's more than one trait that impacts profit, which means that you have to select for multiple traits at the same time. And there's really three ways to do that. One is tandem selection. What tandem selection says is select for trait A, and maybe that's something like post-weaning gain. I'm going to select improve post-weaning gain until I get it at a level that I desire. And once I do that, I'm going to stop selecting on that at all, and I'm going to start on the next trait. The problem with tandem selection, outside of being just inefficient because you're only focusing on one trait at a time, is that these traits are correlated to each other, which means that once I stop selecting on post-weaning gain, if all of a sudden I start selecting to decrease birth weight because I want to reduce dystocia problems, I may actually begin to erode the progress I made in the first trait I selected on, right? So tandem selection, inefficient and can be counterproductive over the long term. The next two I'm going to go through in more detail, independent culling levels and selection indices. And I have an example of an independent culling level on the next slide. So if we go to the example on the next slide, you'll see just kind of a 4 animal example here. I have, let's say, 4 bulls, 1 through 4, and I have EPDs for calving ease, weaning weight, milk, IMF, and then at the end there I have an index, right? This is a fictitious example. In my experience, whether producers call it an independent culling level or not, this is the primary method used to select for multiple traits simultaneously. What this assumes is that the producer sets levels for each trait. And in my example, I set a level of calving ease at 20. Higher is more desirable. It's really related to the probability of having unassisted calves. Weaning weight at 60, milk at 15, and IMF at 0.5. And if this scale doesn't look close to the EPD scale for Wagyu, pardon me, I didn't try to mirror that, but hopefully the example still comes through. If I adhere to these independent culling levels, I would not consider bull 4 in my list because he fails to meet the level I set for calving ease, right? So if I strictly adhere to the levels I set, I would take him off my list. The problem with that, though, is he is by far and away the heaviest for his EPD at weaning, highest for milk, assuming that's desirable for the enterprise, highest for IMF. So superior in all other aspects, and he just barely missed the threshold for one trait. And so consequently, if we think about this bull's potential impact on profit for my enterprise as reflected in his index value, he's actually the best. So independent culling levels, if you strictly adhere to them, kind of assume that every trait is equally important, and that's not true as we're thinking about traits' impact on profit. and it doesn't allow superiority in one trait to offset some potential minor flaws in other traits. So independent culling levels can lead you to suboptimal decisions. It begs the question then, why do we need selection indexes? I like this quote from Dr. Rick Borden, former faculty member at Colorado State, who said there is no easily accessible objective way for breeders, particularly breeders in the beef and sheep industries where ownership is diverse and production environments vary a great deal, to use these predictions intelligently. And by these predictions, he meant EPD. And it's not my belief that Dr. Borden was saying that beef cattle producers are inherently stupid. What he's saying is we've made it too hard, right? We took very valuable tools in the form of expected progeny differences, or EPDs, and then we gave you a bunch of them. And we said, now best of luck going out and making profitable sire selection decisions with all of them. And it can be complex. And so to ease the pain of multiple trait selection, economic selection indices are the preferred route. Next slide, please. So just to remind you, the foundation of selection are EPDs, and they enable directional change. So I can make cattle bigger, I can make them smaller, I can make them have more intramuscular fat, I could make them have less. But I would argue that progress is really conditioned on what the objective is. So bigger may not always be better. Smaller may not always be better. So more isn't better, and maybe less isn't either, right? The direction we go depends on what our objective is. And if we think about economic selection indexes, they're really designed to increase commercial level net profit. And that can be a hard thing for a lot of breed organizations to wrap their head around. So an economic selection index should mean that I am trying to provide a tool such that my customers increase their profitability, right? It's not necessarily a tool to chart breed direction. It's a tool to enable selection for multiple traits that improve profit of my bull customers. The interpretation of an index is this. If we compare two bulls, and I'll have an example here in a bit, for their index value, it's our expectation in the difference of net profit per exposure or per calf marketed between those two bulls, okay, based on their genetic potential. So it's a nice way to be able to compare animals based on difference in profit potential. Next slide, please. I also probably don't need to remind this group that there's considerable lag in our industry. So I have this pyramid, which I think of as a traditional breeding pyramid. At the very top, we have nucleus herds, go all the way down to the bottom. We kind of think about kind of the packer, retailer, consumer aspect of our business. And in between, we have kind of multiplier and commercial herds. Genetics flows down that pyramid. I always remind my colleagues, as well as industry, that the differences we see in the meat we eat starts at the decisions made at the very top of this breeding pyramid, right? Genetics is important all the way through our industry, but there's lag in the genetics making it all the way down. And unfortunately, there's also lag in economic signal that comes back up, right? So what does a packer, retailer, consumer want? That needs to make it back to nucleus herds such that we create genetics that actually match those needs. And so reducing the lag in both directions, I think, is advantageous as we think about not only what traits to select for, but the relative emphasis of those traits in our selection decisions. Next slide. Right, so how to begin? I talked very early on about a breeding objective, and that's where it starts. So what are the goals of my enterprise or my customers if I'm one of those seed stock vendors? And then identifying the traits that directly impact profitability, right? But then along the way, also identifying potential environmental constraints or managerial/labor constraints, because I argue that those constraints manifest into economic signal. Um, and so those kinds of things can be built economically into an index, right? So if you think about labor constraints, that maybe means that all of a sudden decreasing dystocia events become even more important. Um, if you think about environmental constraints, I interpret that as increased cost to feed for the cow herd. Okay, things of that nature. So at a very high level, this is how I think you begin. Next slide, please. And I also encourage people to think about buying bulls in light of having indexes as an investment process. So producers that purchase bulls or semen are tasked with obtaining the best for their operation. But I always argue that best is a relative concept. Um, and so if I compare bulls based on their economic potential for my enterprise, it is very much possible that the quote unquote best one may not be as preferred because the cost of that bull, either the purchase of him or the purchase of his semen, may be greater than the value difference of his index versus an alternate bull's index. So it really gets to the notion of return on investment, which oftentimes in the beef industry, particularly with respect to sire selection, can be a foreign concept. Um, but if you're investing in genetics, and that's what it is, it's an investment in genetics. If you buy bulls or semen, you have to stop and think about, well, what's the return, right? And so that's really the gist of what I'm trying to convey here. And indexes very much help you do that. So the selection index in a nutshell, as I've said before, it's a tool to make informed multiple trait selection decisions. It's based on breeding objectives. So am I retaining ownership through the feed yard? And if so, what's the value-based grid that I market on, right? That helps define part of the breeding objective based on economic parameters. So what's the value of a pound of hot carcass weight? What's the value of different levels of intramuscular fat or of quality grade, right? That gets into economic parameters. What are the relationship among traits? Because we're selecting for multiple traits, we need to know what is the genetic relationship between hot carcass weight and IMF, an example, or between IMF and earlier in life growth traits. Where are we starting from? That's the population or herd mean. The economic signal to increase something may change depending on what my current level of performance is. If my cattle already have extremely high levels of IMF, the economic signal for me to further increase that is different than somebody who maybe has considerably lower levels of IMF. So the current level of performance is important, particularly when the trait may have nonlinear pricing mechanisms, right? So I think a great example of that is different grades related to intermuscular fat. Selection indexes are relatively new to the beef industry at large, so over the past decade or two. But I'd point out are considerably old hat, if you will, to other livestock industries. So I think about poultry and swine, an example, who would have been making selection decisions based off of selection indices for many, many decades. And in fact, the first scientific paper really publishing the notion of a selection index in livestock was in the early 1940s. Can trace back an agronomy paper in the 1930s before then, but by no means completely new science. Next slide, please. So what has an impact on these indices? Well, over time, if the the breeding objective or the breeding goal changes for whatever reason. So there's market signal to make a change in a particular trait that did not exist before. That I think obviously would change the index. Changes to traits with EPD. So if all of a sudden there's a new EPD that comes out that is clearly related to a goal trait, something that's economically relevant, then the inclusion of that EPD in the index would change the index. Any changes to the genetic relationships of the traits or changes to the overall accuracy of EPD that go into the index are going to change it. Maybe over time, if there are changes in the trait definition, so an EPD is in particular units today, but that changes in the future. Changes to economic parameters or assumptions. So obviously, what a pound of hot carcass weight is worth today is different than it was 5 years ago. And I don't know what it's going to be from 5 years from now, other than I feel pretty confident different than today, right? So these things evolve and change, and changing those will lead to changes in the index and the way animals rank. And the other thing is changes in the assumed population averages. Again, what we assume the average hot carcass weight is of an animal today, probably different than it'll be 5 years from now, and those can create changes or should create changes in the indexes as well. So the point being is that these tools are not static, because the component trait EPD change and the weightings of those EPD might change over time as well due to some of these factors that I've mentioned. Next slide. So an index is really nothing more than a bunch of EPD weighted by their marginal economic value. So marginally, how important is a 1 unit change in a trait, holding all else constant? That's the marginal bit. The question is, how do we get those weights? There are a lot of different ways to do it. So one way is to do some calculus. Okay, so break out pen and paper and ask for, well, what's the partial derivative of the profit equation with respect to a given trait? A proxy for that calculus, and actually a very useful proxy, is stochastic simulation. So what stochastic means is that you take into account there's random variation. And the benefit of simulation is that you can simulate, and in today's language, we'd say creating a digital twin of a large beef cattle population, and be able to look at the impact, the economic impact of making a 1 unit change in a trait and holding everything else constant. And so that's what would be done in a simulated scenario. It's really looking at what as I mentioned before, the marginal economic value, or here I call it an MEV, for each trait and the breeding goal or breeding objective, by simulating a group of animals changing, in example, their hot carcass weights by 1 pound, holding all the other traits the same, and then looking at what that did to the change in profit of the enterprise. And that becomes then how we might calculate that trait, hot carcass weights, marginal economic value, then set hot carcass weight to the kind of original value and move to the next trait. Maybe that's IMF, change that by 1 unit, look at how that changes the enterprise's profitability, and we get its marginal economic value. And it's those marginal economic values then that become the weighting of the traits in the index, or some function of it, because if we're using indicator traits, we would leverage the genetic relationship then between that indicator trait and the trait that's really economically impactful. So it's not kind of, well, this feels like the right way to weight a trait. It's really economically based. Next slide, please. So the question then is, well, how do we parameterize such a thing? And I'll kind of break this up into two bits. One is economics. So how do we value a pound of corn or a pound of hot carcass weight? So what economic parameters do you use? Well, um, you can use future values if you're really good at forecasting those things. A bit tongue in cheek here, I say, well, if you're that good at forecasting future economic situations, maybe you ought to just sell your cows and day trade. I've never been that good. If you use current value, the problem is they're already outdated when those calves are fed and sold, right? So if I use current economic values as of today, um, the time I actually produce marketable animals from those matings, my economic assumptions are very, very dated. So using historic values over some long time horizon has generally been shown to be robust. So typical cattle cycles about 10 years. So taking averages of costs and revenues over a 5 to 10 year time horizon is generally robust, because what you want to avoid um, is using values when we're at the peak of some kind of market cycle to inform decisions when calves are going to be marketed towards the bottom of that cycle, or vice versa. So using averages over a longer time horizon provides some robustness against that. So what about current phenotypic mean? So where are we starting from? That should very much be current values. So as a population, um, what is the average hot carcass weight and the distribution around that, average IMF and the distribution around that, et cetera, right? Because that's where you're starting from and want to make improvement from. Both these things need to be revisited over time to ensure an index still is doing a good job at describing profitable selection decisions. Next slide. Just a quick example. On the left-hand side, I have maybe a listing of traits that would be in a breeding objective for what I call a terminal kind of an index. So all calves born are retained through a feed yard and marketed. Um, and then on the right-hand side, I have a list of traits that you could assume EPD either exists or could be developed for. And my point here is there's not one-to-one mapping. And there doesn't have to be one-to-one mapping as long as we understand the genetic relationships between the traits that are really drivers of profit and the traits that we have EPD for. Okay, we can still create a very useful index even if we maybe don't have EPD for all the traits that are truly economic drivers. Next slide. I just want to make the point here too, though, and I would say this to any organization. There's a lot of value um, in being able to truly understand what drives economic value downstream, because there's a lot of economically relevant traits that are not currently evaluated or collected routinely in, I say, the seed stock sector, but really by breed organizations. Um, I list some here in terms of reproductive longevity of commercial females, things related to disease that may exist in feed yards, um, routine carcass data, things that maybe drive packing plant value like primal yield, etc. And so I just put this plug in for all breed organizations to think about the ability to reach downstream and garner data that clearly is a driver for profit of uh, people that take hold of our animals after we relinquish control or after we sell them. Because I think that the closer we can get to making selection decisions that improve their profit, the better off we are. Next slide. These are some examples from other organizations. And the only point I want to make here is the delineation in terminal indexes and what I call general purpose. general purpose says that I'm going to retain some replacement females, and then all the cull females and the steer mates are being sold. And it's really important to identify the breeding objective. So which one of those cases am I in? And then develop tools that match that. And then furthermore, use the correct tool. So if I'll use Angus as an example, they have a terminal index called $B, dollar beef. And as you might expect, it's going to have traits related to carcass quality, so marbling, carcass yield like ribeye and fat. It's going to have hot carcass weight. It's going to have feed intake. That kind of makes intuitive sense. Their maternal index, which is $M, is going to have traits related to weaning weight, mature cow weight, milk, calving ease, maternal, heifer pregnancy, those kinds of things. So it's like any other tool in the toolbox. It works well when you use the right tool for the right job. If I use $M to try to produce profitable terminal calves through the feed yard, I'll do a horrible job at that. Similarly, if I use $beef to try to produce replacement females, I'm probably going to make females that are less fertile and very large and mature size. So using the right tool for the right job, extremely important. Just a quick example of how indexes actually work. I have Bull A and Bull B here, and I have their index values of 180 and 156. If I make the assumption that I will breed these two bulls to 30 cows a year for 4 years, so that's 120 exposures in their lifetime, I can multiply the number of exposures by the difference in their index value and come up with an estimate of how much more profit Bull A will return to me compared to Bull B. In my example, that's about $2,900, right? Because the difference in index value, in this case, 24, that says that Bull A should generate $24 more profit per exposure than Bull B, right? That's the interpretation. And so I can extrapolate that out over the number of opportunities that I may give those bulls, right? So it's a way of not only comparing bulls on a per exposure or per calf basis, but I can also think much more generally about the opportunity for them to add value or profit to my enterprise over a longer time horizon. Next slide, please. Right, I want to go through to the idea of these indexes being sensitive, and I've got a few slides to talk about that. And we've done some what I'd call sensitivity analysis. So, what if our index is wrong, right? How wrong a decision will I make with it then? And that's a very fair question to ask. And so what we've done is looked at the response we would make in an index if we chose different economic parameters, or the relationship among traits was different than we thought it was. And I have that some kind of summary results for you on the next slide. And the two traits, well, really the one trait I pointed out here was hot carcass weight. That's HCW. This EU is efficiency. So 1 is the maximum value. It means that whether I use certain values or different values in the construction of my index, if the efficiency is 1, it didn't matter, right? I'm going to make the same selection decisions, make the same amount of progress. So we looked at changes in the genetic correlations between hot carcass weight and other traits in the index. And generally, the index was robust to those changes, with the exception of when we started changing the genetic correlation with hot carcass weight and other traits, but we had to change it in a really big way. So we went through and changed genetic correlations by a magnitude of 0.4, which is huge. And then we saw some sensitivity, but within the bounds of reasonableness, it was very insensitive to those changes. I also looked at changes in the economic parameters for hot carcass weight, and we had to change those by 50% um, before we saw any sensitivity, right? So the point here is that these tools have been shown to be pretty insensitive or pretty robust to a lot of the changes that we may impose, right? I also looked at whether it was a calf fed or yearling fed system, and that didn't seem to have any impact. Okay, so fairly robust tools. There are opportunities, though, or potential places where we could see some changes, and I have examples of that on the next slide. And what I built these examples or these following examples with is some web-based decision support software we called iGenDeck. This is available through the Beef Improvement Federation. And so encourage you, if you want to go to the BIF website, you can get a trial account and play around with it if you're so inclined. But this is what I use to build the following examples. So on the next slide, show kind of what I was looking at. If I changed hot carcass weight from an average of 850 pounds to 920 to 950, and I assumed that there was a discount threshold at, I think I assumed 1050, which I understand that may not be relevant anymore, but it still illustrates what happens when the population or herd gets closer and closer to a potential discount. And then I also looked at changes in death loss due to dystocia, going from 0% death loss up to 2% death loss due to dystocia. And what I wanted to look at is how does that change the relative emphasis of traits in my breeding objective. And so I've got some pie charts on the next slide, which begin to show that. And I understand this may be a bit hard to see, but I'll walk you through it. On the upper left, the red part of these pie charts is the relative emphasis for hot carcass weight, which means, relatively speaking, how important is hot carcass weight as a driver of profit. And when hot carcass weight was the lowest, it accounted for about 41% of the emphasis in my breeding objective. But as I changed the average hot carcass weight to be larger and larger, meaning that the average got closer and closer to where there was a discount threshold, the relative emphasis of hot carcass weight became less and less. So that's why it's important to understand where a population, and that could be if we're talking about a breed-wide index, the breed, where does it stand today? Because that could change not only, that could change the amount of emphasis that needs to be placed on different traits. The next slide shows the dystocia example. And if you'll recall, I assumed 0% death loss due to dystocia or 2%. When there was 0% death loss due to dystocia, calving ease direct, and birth weight would be a indicator of that, received zero emphasis in my breeding objective, right? It says economically you don't have a problem with dystocia, so there's other things you should focus on. If I moved it up to 2%, which would be a very big death loss due to dystocia, all of a sudden calving ease received 10% of the emphasis in my breeding objective. So pretty dramatic change. Again, illustrating understanding where you're starting from can be very important. And so this is a case where there can be sensitivity to indexes, and it needs to be built with an understanding of how animals perform currently. Next slide, please. All right. This is a heat map. So darker red means stronger correlation. The yellow means weaker correlation. I've got a legend there on the right. And if you hit the button, the advanced button, I think I've got some circles that show up. But what I wanted to illustrate was if you look on these axes, there are W's, that means I sold calves at weaning, and there are C's, which means I sold cattle in the beef. And then the numbers next to them, the 2 through 50, is the length of the planning horizon. So that's how long into the future in years I want to contemplate the costs and returns associated with my sire selection decision. Okay, which is most important if I contemplate the retention of replacement females, as I mentioned kind of at the top of the presentation. And that 2 points I really want to make here is that if I sell at weaning and use an index that assumes I sell in the beef or vice versa, there could be substantial re-ranking among bulls. Okay, if you look at the top left of this, that kind of makes that comparison, and there's not very strong correlations there. Similarly, if I have a short-term planning horizon versus a long-term planning horizon, that can lead to different selection decisions too. And that's kind of represented if you look in the top right, you'll see that there's kind of two red squares there. But those aren't highly related to each other. So shorter term planning horizons more closely mirror each other, longer term planning horizons more closely mirror each other. And that's again because in longer term planning horizons, I may put more emphasis on things that impact the cow herd. Shorter term emphasis, I put more, or shorter term planning horizons, I put more emphasis on revenue traits. So really the terminal calves. And so it's just a awareness that short-term profit may not be the same as long-term profit if replacement females are indeed retained. Okay, next slide. There are my circles. So some key messages here. So as you think about indexes and even developing one, current population performance matters. And I have here, particularly when pricing is nonlinear with the trait. Okay, and I think IMF or marbling is a great example of that because I don't necessarily get paid for every 1 unit change in IMF. I get paid when it changes enough to cross a threshold to get into a different grade. So that creates the nonlinearity. So knowing where I'm starting from there can be important. I have choice of endpoint matters. So whether it's people retain ownership all the way through or maybe relinquish ownership at some point earlier along the way. And if replacements are retained, length of planning horizon can very much matter as well, although that's a bit moot for terminal indexes when no replacements are being retained. Next slide. So the task, I would say, with genetic evaluations has always been taking data, that the stuff breeders turn in, turning it into knowledge, which I would argue is the EPDs. But as we think about indexes, it goes one step further. And on the next slide, I show turning that those tools, the EPDs, into actually actionable decisions. And indexes help people do that. So making use of all of the EPDs and putting it into action through an economically optimized selection index, which hopefully helps people then improve profit through genetic selection. All right, I think I have maybe just a couple more slides here. Even though as you think about using and developing indexes, new tools alone don't enable selection for profit or for sustainability. To quote Slowhand, it's in the way that you use it, right? So again, any tool can be misused. You have to use the right tool for the right job. And then I think on my last slide here, just a plug for the sire selection manual. If you go to ebeef.org, you can get PDF versions of this, or if you shoot me an email, I'd be happy to mail you a hard copy of it. Has all things beef cattle genetics related in it. And and it was designed for producers. So relatively friendly read if you want to learn more about genetics at large. And then on the very last slide, I think I have some links to helpful resources. Beef Improvement Federation at beefimprovement.org, UNL beef production website, required by state law to mention that one. And then the last would be ebeef.org, which is where I mentioned you could get that sire selection manual. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that the group has. And if you don't want to ask today, feel free to shoot me an email. Happy to correspond that way. But thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Spangler, so much. I always learn something new when I hear you talk about selection and disease. So, all right, we have a little bit of time. I think we got around 15 minutes. If anyone has a question, you can type it in the Q&A or in the chat, and we can get Dr. Spangler's opinion on it. Some insight. And if not, if you don't have any questions right now, you can always forward them on. And I think that hard copy of Beef Selection, I might just get it from you, and I can get it around as well.
Yep. Nope. That'd be fine. However you want to do it. Yep.
All right. If nobody has a question, I have a quick question. So Dr. Spangler, do you see, I know that in the beef industry, we're still working on adoption of EPDs as well as indices. Do you see kind of a good concurrent adoption of both, or do you see indices taking over more than EPDs, or EPDs taking over more than indices?
Yeah. So, well, if I look at what other what organizations, breed organizations, have done over time, as economic indices have been released, they most certainly haven't pulled back publishing EPDs. EPDs are needed for the index, but they still provide members and breeders with all of the component EPDs, and most certainly have continued to develop EPDs for new traits. So those have kind of co-evolved, if you will.
Yep.
I think some organizations are pretty keyed in to their respective breed organization indexes, because just like EPDs, not only are indexes very useful at making selection decisions, they're also extremely useful advertising tools. So instead of just advertising that I'm in the top 1% of the breed for XYZ trait, people like to be able to advertise I'm in the top 1% of the breed for profit. So extremely beneficial advertising tool. And so because of that, may not be for all the reasons I'd prefer, but indexes have become very popular.
Yes.
And I don't see that changing. I think they'll continue to evolve over time, so new traits could be included in them, but I don't see them going away.
I agree. All right, we have a couple questions from the audience. So Adam asks, so should seed stock producers be using selection indices?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. My answer would be yes. And the reason I would say yes is because we want to, well, I would argue we would want to continue to improve the commercial level profit potential of our seed stock herds, and selecting on an index does that. So, although we certainly want to point the bull buyers to using the indexes, we also have to be cognizant of them too, to make sure we're advancing that index over time. Now, I say that to say this: there may be seed stock enterprises that say, well, out of all the traits in the index, this is the thing that I am absolutely best at, right? I'm going to plant a flag and say, you know, if you want to improve XYZ trait, this is where you come to do it. And so that may mean that there's something else for that seed stock enterprise that is the primary selection criterion. It's not ignoring the complete index, but that's a decision enterprises have to make on their own. The short answer is, though, yes, seed stock producers should be utilizing the index as well to make sure they continually advance genetic potential for profit over generations.
Awesome. We have another question from Steve. Do we follow the same process on selecting females?
You can. The question becomes, what is the so I'll answer that in two ways. If I'm a seed stock producer, the answer's yes, because the goal of those seed stock females is to eventually make germplasm that the commercial industry is going to use. If I'm a commercial producer, it depends on what the index is. Because what I need that female to do may be different than what I need her steer mate to do. So it kind of it goes back to what's the breeding objective, and does the index match it?
I agree. Matt has a question. I'm not quite sure what he's getting at here. He said EPDs versus EBVs.
Yeah. So it's confusing. So just like we use the English system and the rest of the world uses the metric system, we report EPDs and the rest of the world uses EBVs. So an EBV is an estimated breeding value. EPD, of course, an expected progeny difference. The difference between the two, if I have an EBV and I divide it by 2, I now have an EPD. That's all it is, right? It's a division by 2.
Yeah.
So it's just a difference in the way different evaluations, different countries report things.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's what he was trying to get at. I wasn't 100% sure. All right, any more questions for Matt?
All right, I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to visit with you folks, and I mean it. If you do have additional questions, I wasn't clear about something, or you have questions about something I didn't cover, don't hesitate to reach out. Oh, there was another chat that came in.
Just came in. Jerry asked, our industry is really based on F1s, that crossbreeding. Does this change how we use our indices?
I don't know that it changes necessarily how you use them, but it most certainly changes how you construct them. Because it would be a different set of assumptions if I say, well, I'm going to paint a picture of the phenotype of a 100% Wagyu animal versus an F1, because those are different. And so if the intended use has an F1 in mind, then the index needs to be built assuming that, because it'll lead you to a different place, I believe. From that point on, I don't necessarily think it changes how you use the index, but it does change the way you think about building one.
All right. Yeah, that's kind of our, a huge part of our industry are those F1s. So we have a lot of thinking to do when it comes to terminal indices, for sure.
Yeah. Because again, how an F1 performs is different, and so if that's the target, like I said, it just changes the assumptions you make when you build it.
Yep. All right, I'm going to let Matt finish up here and get on with the rest of his day. Again, I want to thank you so much, and this is recorded for anyone anyone's use, and make sure to reach out to Matt or myself if you guys have any questions. But let's give Matt a big thank you and be on your way for the day. Thank you guys so much.
Sounds good. Take care. Thank you again.
Have a good one, everyone. Happy Friday.